Section 42 of The Bertrams by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 12. Mrs. Wilkinson's Troubles. Arthur Wilkinson was received at home with open arms and warm embraces. He was an only son and only brother, the head and stay of his family, and of course he was beloved. His mother wept for joy as she saw the renewed plumpness of his cheeks, and declared that Egypt must indeed be a land of fatness. And his sisters surrounded him, smiling and kissing him, and asking questions, as though he were another Livingstone. This was very delightful, but a cloud was soon to come across all this sunshine. Mrs. Wilkinson, always accepting what care she may have had for her son's ill health, had not been unhappy during his absence. She had reigned the female vicaress without a drawback, praying daily, and in her heart almost hourly, for the continuance in the land of such excellent noblemen as Lord Stapledean. The curate who had taken Arthur's duty had been a very mild young man, and had been quite contented that Mrs. Wilkinson should leave to him the pulpit and the reading desk. In all other matters he had been satisfied not to interfere with her power, or to contradict her edicts. "Mr. Gilliflower has behaved excellently," she said to her son soon after his return, "and has quite understood my position here. I only wish we could keep him in the parish, but that of course is impossible." "I shouldn't want him at all, mother," Arthur had replied. "I'm as strong as a horse now." "All the same, I should like to have him here," said Mrs. Wilkinson, in a tone which was the beginning of the battle. How sweet it would have been to her if Arthur could have gone to some good neighbouring parish, leaving her with Gabriel Gilliflower as her assistant, to manage the souls of Hurst Staple. And why, as she almost asked herself, why should she not be addressed as the Reverend Mrs. Wilkinson? But the battle had to be fought, and there was to be an end to these sweet dreams. Her son had been meek enough, but he was not as meek as Mr. Gilliflower, and now he was sharpening his arrows and looking to his bow, and preparing for the war. "Is Adela at Littlebath?" he asked of one of his sisters on the third or fourth day after his arrival. "Yes," said Mary, "she is with her aunt. I had a letter from her yesterday." "I wonder whether she would come here if you were to ask her." "Oh, that she would," said Mary. "I doubt it very much," said the more prudent Sophia. Mrs. Wilkinson heard the conversation and pondered over it. At the moment she said nothing, pressing down her grief in her deep heart; but that evening in the book room she found Arthur alone, and then she began. "You were not in earnest just now about Adela, were you, Arthur?" "Indeed I was, mother; quite in earnest." "She has been very much away from Littlebath since her aunt came back from Italy to make a home for her. She was with us, and with the Harcourts, in London, and since the break up there she was at Hadley. It would not be right to Miss Gauntlet to ask her away so soon." "I don't think Miss Gauntlet would mind her coming here; and even if she does—" "And then my time is so much taken up, what with the schools and what with the parish visiting." "Adela will do the visiting with you." "I really had rather not have her just at present; that is, unless you have some very particular reason." "Well, mother, I have a particular reason. But if you had rather that she did not come here, I will go to Littlebath instead." There was nothing more said on this occasion, but that was the beginning of the battle. Mrs. Wilkinson could not but know what her son meant, and she now knew that all that she dreaded was to come upon her. It was not that she did not wish to see her son happy, or that she did not think that his being married and settled would tend to his happiness; but she was angry, as other mothers are angry, when their foolish calf-like boys will go and marry without any incomes on which to support a wife. She said to herself over and over again that night, "I cannot have a second family here in the parsonage, that's certain. Where on earth they're to live, I don't know; and how they're to live when his fellowship is gone, I can't think." And then she shook her head, clothed as it was in her nightcap, and reposing as it was on her pillow. £2,000 is every shilling she has, every shilling. And then she shook her head again. She knew that the ecclesiastical income was her own, for had not the good Lord Stapledean given it to her? But she had sad thoughts, and feared that even on this point there might be a contest between her and her son. 2 mornings after this the blow came very suddenly. It was now her habit to go into the book room after breakfast, and set herself down to work, as her husband, the former vicar, had done in his time, and as Arthur, since his return, usually did the same. They naturally found themselves alone together. On the morning in question she had no sooner seated herself with her papers before her than Arthur began. And, alas! he had to tell her, not what he was going to do, but what he had done. "I spoke to you, mother, of going to Littlebath the other day." "Yes, Arthur," said she, taking her spectacles off and laying them beside her. "I have written to her instead." "And you have made her an offer of marriage?" "Exactly so. I was sure you must have known how my heart stood towards her. It is many years now since I first thought of this; but I was deterred because I feared that my income, our income, that is, was insufficient." "Oh, Arthur! And so it is. What will you do? How will you live? Adela has got just £2,000, about £70 or £80 a year, and your fellowship will be gone. How will all the mouths be fed when you have 6 or 7 children round you?" "I'll tell you what my plans are. If Adela should accept me—" "Oh, accept you! She'll accept you fast enough," said Mrs. Wilkinson, with the venom with which mothers will sometimes speak of the girls to whom their sons are attached. "It makes me very happy to hear you say so. But I don't know. When I did hint at the matter once before, I got no encouragement." "Psha!" said Mrs. Wilkinson. This sound was music to her son's ears, so he went on with the more cheerfulness to describe his plans. "You see, mother, situated as I am, I have no right to expect any increase of income, or to hope that I shall ever be better able to marry than I am now." "But you might marry a girl who had something to help. There is Miss Glunter." "But it so happens that I am attached to Adela, and not to Miss Glunter." "Attached! But of course you must have your own way. You are of age, and I cannot prevent your marrying the cookmaid if you like. What I want to know is, where do you mean to live?" "Here, certainly." "What! in this house?" "Certainly. I am bound to live here as the clergyman of the parish." Mrs. Wilkinson drew herself up to her full height, put her spectacles on, and looked at the papers before her, then put them off again, and fixed her eyes on her son. "Do you think there will be room in the house?" she said. "I fear you would be preparing great discomfort for Adela. Where on earth would she find room for a nursery? But, Arthur, you have not thought of these things." Arthur, however, had thought of them very often. He knew where to find the nursery and the room for Adela. His difficulty was as to the rooms for his mother and sisters. It was necessary now that this difference of opinion should be explained. "I suppose that my children, if I have any—" "Clergymen always have large families," said Mrs. Wilkinson.
Well, I suppose they'll have the same nursery that we had.
What, and turn Sophie and Mary out of it?
And then she paused, and began to rearrange her papers.
That will not do at all, Arthur, she continued. It would be unjust in me to allow that. Much as I think of your interests, I must of course think of theirs as well.
How was he to tell her that the house was his own? It was essentially necessary that he should do so, and that he should do so now. If he gave up the point at the present moment, he might give it up for ever. His resolve was, that his mother and sisters should go elsewhere; but in what words could he explain this resolution to her? Dear mother, I think we should understand each other.
Certainly, said Mrs. Wilkinson,
laying her hands across each other on the table, and preparing for the onslaught. It is clearly my duty as clergyman to live in this parish, and to live in this house.
And it is my duty also, as was excellently explained by Lord Stapledean after your poor father's death.
My idea is this. And then he paused, for his heart misgave him when he attempted to tell his mother that she must pack up and turn out. His courage all but failed him. He felt that he was right, and yet he hardly knew how to explain that he was right without appearing to be unnatural. I do not know that Lord Stapledean said anything about the house, but if he did, it could make no difference.
Not the least, I should think, said the lady. When he appointed me to the income of the parish, it could hardly be necessary that he should explain that I was to have the house also.
Mother, when I accepted the living, I promised him that I would give you £350 out of the proceeds, and so I will. Adela and I will be very poor, but I shall endeavour to eke out our income. That is, of course, if she consents to marry me.
Psha!
To eke out our income by taking pupils. To do that, I must have the house at my own disposal.
And you mean to tell me,
said the female vicaress, rising to her feet in her wrath,
that I am to go away?
I think it will be better, mother.
And the poor girls?
For one or two of them there would be room here, said Arthur, trying to palliate the matter.
One or two of them? Is that the way you would treat your sisters? I say nothing about myself, for I have long seen that you are tired of me. I know how jealous you are because Lord Stapledean has thought proper to.
She could not exactly remember what phrase would best suit her purpose.
To place me here as he placed your poor father before. I have seen it all, Arthur. But I have my duty to do, and I shall do it. What I have undertaken in this parish, I shall go through with, and if you oppose me, I shall apply to his lordship.
I think you have misunderstood Lord Stapledean.
I have not misunderstood him at all. I know very well what he meant, and I quite appreciate his motives. I have endeavoured to act up to them, and shall continue to do so. I had thought that I had made the house as comfortable to you as any young man could wish.
And so you have.
And yet you want to turn me out of it, out of my own house.
Not to turn you out, mother. If it suits you to remain here for another year.
It will suit me to remain here for another 10 years, if I am spared so long. Little viper! I suppose this comes from her, after warming her in my bosom when her father died.
It can hardly have come from her, seeing that there has never yet been a word spoken between us on the subject. I fear that you greatly mistake the footing on which we stand together. I have no reasonable ground for hoping for a favourable answer.
Psha!
Viper! exclaimed Mrs. Wilkinson, in dire wrath. Mothers are so angry when other girls, not their own, will get offers, so doubly angry when their own sons make them. You will make me very unhappy if you speak ill of her, said Arthur.
Has it ever come into your head to think where your mother and sisters are to live when you turn them out?" said she.
"Littlebath?" suggested Arthur.
"Littlebath!"
said Mrs. Wilkinson, with all the scorn that she could muster to the service.
"Littlebath! I am to put up with the aunt, I suppose, when you take the niece. But I shall not go to Littlebath at your bidding, sir."
And so saying, she gathered up her spectacles and stalked out of the room. Arthur was by no means satisfied with the interview, and yet had he been wise he might have been. The subject had been broached, and that in itself was a great deal. And the victory had by no means been with Mrs. Wilkinson. She had threatened, indeed, to appeal to Lord Stapledean; but that very threat showed how conscious she was that she had no power of her own to hold her place where she was. He ought to have been satisfied, but he was not so. And now he had to wait for his answer from Adela. Gentlemen who make offers by letter must have a weary time of it, waiting for the return of post, or for the return of two posts, as was the case in this instance. And Arthur had a weary time of it. 2 evenings he had to pass, after the conversation above recounted, before he got his letter; and dreadful evenings they were. His mother was majestic, glum, and cross. His sisters were silent and dignified. It was clear to him that they had all been told, and so told as to be leagued in enmity against him. What account their mother may have given to them of their future poverty he knew not; but he felt certain that she had explained to them how cruelly he meant to turn them out on the wide world. Unnatural ogre that he was! Mary was his favourite, and to her he did say a few words. "Mamma has told you what I have done, hasn't she?"
"Yes, Arthur," said Mary, demurely.
"And what do you think about it?"
"Think about it?"
"Yes. Do you think she'll accept me?"
"Oh, she'll accept you. I don't doubt about that."
How cheap girls do make themselves when talking of each other! "And will it not be an excellent thing for me?" said he.
"But about the house, Arthur?"
And Mary looked very glum. So he said nothing further to any of them. On the day after this he got his answer, and now we will give the 2 letters. Arthur's was not written without much trouble and various copies, but Adela's had come straight from her heart at once. Hurst Staple, April, 184 . My dear Adela, you will be surprised to receive a letter from me, and more so, I am sure, when you read its contents. You may have heard, I know, from Mary, of my return home. Thank God, I am quite strong again. I enjoyed my trip very much. I had feared that it would be very dull before I knew that George Bertram would go with me. I wonder whether you recollect the day when I drove you to Ripley Station. It is 18 months ago now, I believe, and indeed the time seems much longer. I had thought then to have said to you what I have to say now, but I did not. Years ago I thought to do the same, and then also I did not. You will know what I mean. I did not like to ask you to share such poverty, such a troubled house as mine will be. But I have loved you, Adela, for years and years. Do you remember how you used to comfort me at that grievous time when I disappointed them all so much about my degree? I remember it so well. It used to lie on my tongue then to tell you that I loved you, but that would have been folly. Then came my poor father's death, and the living which I had to take under such circumstances. I made up my mind then that it was my duty to live single. I think I told you, though I am sure you forget that. I am not richer now, but I am older. I seem to care less about poverty on my own behalf, and, though I don't know whether you will forgive me for this, I feel less compunction in asking you to be poor with me. Do not imagine from this that I feel confident as to your answer. I am very far from that. But I know that you used to love me as a friend, and I now venture to ask you to love me as my wife. Dearest Adela, I feel that I may call you so now, even if I am never to call you so again. If you will share the world with me, I will give you whatever love can give, though I can give but little more. I need not tell you how we should be circumstanced. My mother must have £350 out of the living as long as she lives, and should I survive her, I must of course maintain the girls. But I mean to explain to my mother that she had better live elsewhere. There will be trouble about this, but I am sure that it is right. I shall tell her of this letter to morrow. I think she knows what my intention is, though I have not exactly told it to her. I need not say how anxious I shall be till I hear from you. I shall not expect a letter till Thursday morning, but if possible, do let me have it then. Should it be favourable, though I do not allow myself to have any confidence, but should it be favourable, I shall be at Littlebath on Monday evening. Believe me that I love you dearly. Yours, dear Adela, Arthur Wilkinson. Aunt Penelope was a lady addicted to very early habits, and consequently she and Adela had usually left the breakfast table before the postman had visited them. From this it resulted that Adela received her letter by herself. The first words told her what it contained, and her eyes immediately became suffused with tears. After all, then, her patience was to be rewarded. But it had not been patience so much as love, love that admitted of no change, love on which absence had had no effect, love which had existed without any hope, which had been acknowledged by herself, and acknowledged as a sad misfortune. But now? She took the letter up, but she could not read it. She turned it over, and at the end, through her tears, she saw those words, "Believe me that I love you dearly." They were not like the burning loves, the sweet violent protestations of a passionate lover, but coming from him they were enough. At last she was to be rewarded. And then at length she read it. Ah, yes, she recollected the day well when he had driven her to Ripley Station, and asked her those questions as he was persuading Dumpling to mount the hill. The very words were still in her ears. Would you come to such a house, Adela? Ay, indeed, would she, if only she were duly asked. But he? Had it not seemed then as if he almost wished that the proffer should come from her? Not to that would she stoop. But as for sharing such a house as his, any house with him, what did true love mean if she were not ready to do that? And she remembered, too, that comforting of which he spoke. That had been the beginning of it all, when he took those walks along the river to West Putford, when she had learned to look for his figure coming through the little wicket at the bottom of their lawn. Then she had taxed her young heart with imprudence, but in doing so she had found that it was too late. She had soon told the truth, to herself that is, and throughout she had been true. Now she had her reward, there in her hands, pressing it to her heart. He had loved her for years and years, he said. Yes, and so had she loved him. And now he should know it, but not quite at once. In some sweet hour of fullest confidence she would whisper it all to him. I think I told you, though I am sure that you have forgotten that. Forget it? No, not a word, not one of his tones, not a glance of his eyes, as he sat there in her father's drawing room that morning, all but unable to express his sorrows. She could never forget the effort with which she had prevented the tell-tale blood from burning in her cheeks, or the difficulty with which she had endured his confidence. But she had endured it, and now had come her reward. Then he had come to tell her that he was too poor to marry. Much as she loved him, she had then almost despised him. But the world had told him to be wiser. The world which makes so many niggards had taught him to be freer of heart. Now he was worthy of her, now that he cared nothing for poverty. Yes, now she had her reward. He had allowed her till the second post for her reply. That was so kind of him, as it was necessary that she should tell her aunt. As to the nature of her reply, as to that she never doubted for a moment. She would consult her aunt, but she would do so with her mind fully made up as to the future. No aunt, no Mrs. Wilkinson, should rob her of her happiness now that he had spoken. No one should rob him of the comfort of her love. In the evening, after thinking of it for hours, she told her aunt, or rather handed to her Arthur's letter, that she might read it. Miss Penelope's face grew very long as she did read it, and she made this remark: £350! Why, my dear, there will be only 150 left. We can't keep our carriage, certainly, aunt. Then you mean to accept him? Yes, aunt. Oh dear, oh dear! What will you do when the children come? We must make the best of it, aunt. Oh dear, oh dear! And you will have his mother with you always. If so, then we should not be so very poor. But I do not think that that is what Arthur means. There was not much more said about it between them, and at last, in the seclusion of her own bedroom, Adela wrote her letter. Littlebath, Tuesday night. Dear Arthur, I received your letter this morning, but as you were so kind as to give me a day to answer it, I have put off doing so till I could be quite alone. It will be a very simple answer. I value your love more than anything in the world. You have my whole heart. I hope for your sake that the troubles which you speak of will not be many, but whatever they may be, I will share them. If I can, I will lessen them. I hope it is not unmaidenly to say that I have received your dear letter with true delight. I do not know why it should be. We have known each other so long that it is almost natural that I should love you. I do love you dearly, dearest Arthur, and with a heart thankful for God's goodness to me, I will put my hand in yours with perfect trust, fearing nothing then, as far as this world is concerned. I do not regard the poverty of which you speak, at least not for my own sake. What I have of my own is, I know, very little. I wish now that I could make it more for you. But no, I will wish for nothing more, seeing that so much has been given to me. Everything has been given to me when I have your love. I hope that this will not interfere with your mother's comfort. If anything now could make me unhappy, it would be that she should not be pleased at our prospects. Give her my kindest love, and tell her that I hope she will let me look on her as a mother. I will write to Mary very soon, but bid her write to me first. I cannot tell her how very happy I really am, till she has first wished me joy. I have of course told Aunt Penelope. She too says something about poverty. I tell her it is croaking. The honest do not beg their bread, do they, Arthur? But in spite of her croaking, she will be very happy to see you on Monday, if it shall suit you to come. If so, let me have one other little line. But I am so contented now that I shall hardly be more so even to have you here. God bless you, my own dearest. Ever yours with truest affection, Adela. And I also hope that Adela's letter will not be considered unmaidenly. But I have my fears. There will be those who say that it is sadly deficient in reserve. Ah, had she not been reserved enough for the last 4 or 5 years? Reserve is beautiful in a maiden if it be rightly timed. Sometimes one would fain have more of it. But when the heart is full, and when it may speak out, when time and circumstances and the world permit, then we should say that honesty is better than reserve. Adela's letter was honest on the spur of the moment. Her reserve had been the work of years. Arthur at any rate was satisfied. Her letter seemed to him to be the very perfection of words. Armed with that, he would face his mother, though she appeared armed from head to foot in the Stapledean panoply. While he was reading his letter, he was at breakfast with them all, and when he had finished it for the second time, he handed it across the table to his mother.
"Oh, I suppose so,"
was her only answer, as she gave it him back. The curiosity of the girls was too great now for the composure of their silent dignity.
"It is from Adela," said Mary. "What does she say?"
"You may read it," said Arthur, again handing the letter across the table.
"Well, I wish you joy," said Mary, "though there will be so very little money."
Seeing that Arthur, since his father's death, had in fact supported his mother and sisters out of his own income, this reception of his news was rather hard upon him. And so he felt it. "You will not have to share the hardships," he said, as he left the room, "and so you need not complain." There was nothing more said about it that morning; but in the evening, when they were alone, he spoke to his sister again. "You will write to her, Mary, I hope?"
"Yes, I will write to her," said Mary, half ashamed of herself.
"Perhaps it is not surprising that my mother should be vexed, seeing the false position in which both she and I have been placed, partly by my fault; for I should not have accepted the living under such conditions."
"Oh, Arthur, you would not have refused it."
"I ought to have done so. But, Mary, you and the girls should be ready to receive Adela with open arms. What other sister could I have given you that you would have loved better?"
"Oh, no one; not for her own sake; no one half so well."
"Then tell her so, and do not cloud her prospects by writing about the house. You have all had shelter and comfort hitherto, and be trustful that it will be continued to you." This did very well with his sister; but the affair with his mother was much more serious. He began by telling her that he should go to Littlebath on Monday, and be back on Wednesday.
"Then I shall go to Bowes on Wednesday," said Mrs. Wilkinson.
Now we all know that Bowes is a long way from Staplehurst. The journey has already been made once in these pages; but Mrs. Wilkinson was as good as her word. "To Bowes?" said Arthur.
"Yes, to Bowes, sir; to Lord Stapledean. That is, if you hold to your scheme of turning me out of my own house."
"I think it would be better, mother, that we should have two establishments."
"And therefore I am to make way for you, and that
Viper, she was going to say again; but looking into her son's face, she became somewhat more merciful.
"For you," she said, "and that chit."
"As clergyman of the parish, I think that I ought to live in the parsonage. You, mother, will have so much the larger portion of the income."
"Very well. There need be no more words about it. I shall start for Bowes on the next Wednesday."
And so she did. Arthur wrote his one other little line. As it was 3 times as long as his first letter, it shall not be printed. And he did make his visit to Littlebath. How happy Adela was as she leant trustingly on his arm, and felt that it was her own. He stayed, however, but one night, and was back at Staplehurst before his mother started for Bowes. End of Project Gutenberg Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Section 43 of The Bertrams by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 13. Another Journey to Bowes.
Mrs. Wilkinson did not leave her home for her long and tedious journey without considerable parade. Her best new black silk dress was packed up, in order that due honour might be done to Lord Stapledean's hospitality, and so large a box was needed that Dumpling and the four-wheeled carriage were hardly able to take her to the railway station. Then there arose the question who should drive her. Arthur offered to do so, but she was going on a journey of decided hostility as regarded him, and under such circumstances she could not bring herself to use his services, even over a portion of the road. So the stable boy was her charioteer. She talked about Lord Stapledean the whole evening before she went. Arthur would have explained to her something of that nobleman's character if she would have permitted it, but she would not. When he hinted that she would find Lord Stapledean austere in his manner, she answered that his lordship no doubt had his reasons for being austere with so very young a man as Arthur had been. When he told her about the Bowes Hotel, she merely shook her head significantly. A nobleman who had been so generous to her and hers as Lord Stapledean would hardly allow her to remain at the inn. "I am very sorry that the journey is forced upon me," she said to Arthur, as she sat with her bonnet on, waiting for the vehicle. "I am sorry that you are going, mother, certainly," he had answered, "because I know that it will lead to disappointment." "But I have no other course left open to me," she continued. "I cannot see my poor girls turned out houseless on the world." And then, refusing even to lean on her son's arm, she stepped up heavily into the carriage and seated herself beside the boy. "When shall we expect you, mamma?" said Sophia. "It will be impossible for me to say, but I shall be sure to write as soon as I have seen his lordship. Good bye to you, girls." And then she was driven away. "It is a very foolish journey," said Arthur. "Mamma feels that she is driven to it," said Sophia. Mrs. Wilkinson had written to Lord Stapledean 2 days before she started, informing his lordship that it had become very necessary that she should wait upon him on business connected with the living, and therefore she was aware that her coming would not be wholly unexpected. In due process of time she arrived at Bowes, very tired, and not a little disgusted at the great expense of her journey. She had travelled but little alone, and knew nothing as to the cost of hotels, and not a great deal as to that of railways, coaches, and post chaises. But at last she found herself in the same little inn which had previously received Arthur when he made the same journey. "The lady can have a post chaise, of course," said the landlady, speaking from the bar. "Oh yes, Lord Stapledean is at home, safe enough. He's never very far away from it, to the best of my belief." "It's only a mile or so, is it?" said Mrs. Wilkinson. "7 long miles, ma'am," said the landlady. 7 miles! Dear, dear! I declare I never was so tired in my life. You can put the box somewhere behind in the post chaise, can't you?" "Yes, ma'am, we can do that. Be you a going to stay at his lordship's, then?" To this question Mrs. Wilkinson made an ambiguous answer. Her confidence was waning now that she drew near to the centre of her aspirations. But at last she did exactly as her son had done before her. She said that she would take her box, but that it was possible she might want a bed that evening. "Very possible," the landlady said to herself. "And you'll take a bite of something before you start, ma'am?" she said out loud. But no, it was only now 12 o'clock, and she would be at Bowes Lodge a very little after 1. She had still sufficient confidence in Lord Stapledean to feel sure of her lunch.
When people reached Hurst Staple Vicarage about that hour, there was always something for them to eat. And so she started. It was April now, but even in April that bleak northern fell was very cold. Nothing more inhospitable than that road could be seen. It was unsheltered, swept by every blast, very steep, and mercilessly oppressed by turnpikes. Twice in those 7 miles 1 and 6pence was inexorably demanded from her.
"But I know one gate always clears the other when they are so near," she argued.
"No, they don't," was all the answer she received from the turnpike woman, who held a baby under each arm.
"I am sure the woman is robbing me," said poor Mrs. Wilkinson.
"No, she bain't," said the post boy. "They are good hearty people in that part of the world, but they do not brook suspicion, and the courtesies of life are somewhat neglected." And then she arrived at Lord Stapledean's gate. "Be you she what sent the letter?" said the woman at the lodge, holding it only half open.
"Yes, my good woman, yes," said Mrs. Wilkinson, thinking that her troubles were now nearly over. "I am the lady. I am Mrs. Wilkinson."
"Then my lord says as how you're to send up word what you've got to say."
And the woman still stood in the gateway.
"Send up word!" said Mrs. Wilkinson. "Yes, just send up word. Here's Jock can run up."
"But Jock can't tell his lordship what I have to say to him. I have to see his lordship on most important business," said she in her dismay.
"I'm telling you no more than what my lord said his ain sell. He just crawled down here his ain sell. 'If a woman comes,' said he, 'don't let her through the gate till she sends up word what she's got to say to me.'"
And the portress looked as though she were resolved to obey her master's orders. "Good heavens! There must be some mistake in this, I am sure. I am the clergyman of Staplehurst. I mean his widow. Staplehurst, you know, his lordship's property."
"I didna know nothing aboot it."
"Oh, drive on, post boy. There must be some mistake. The woman must be making some dreadful mistake." At last the courage of the lodge keeper gave way before the importance of the post chaise, and she did permit Mrs. Wilkinson to proceed.
"Mither," said the woman's eldest hope, "you'll cotch it noo." "Eh, lad, well, he'll no hang me."
And so the woman consoled herself. The house called Bowes Lodge looked damper and greener, more dull, silent, and melancholy even than it had done when Arthur made his visit. The gravel sweep before the door was covered by weeds, and the shrubs looked as though they had known no gardener's care for years. The door itself did not even appear to be for purposes of ingress and egress, and the post boy had to search among the boughs and foliage with which the place was overgrown before he could find the bell. When found, it sounded with a hoarse, rusty, jangling noise, as though angry at being disturbed in so unusual a manner. But, rusty and angry as it was, it did evoke a servant, though not without considerable delay. A cross old man did come at last, and the door was slowly opened.
"Yes," said the man, "the marquis was at home, no doubt. He was in the study, but that was no rule why he should see folk."
And then he looked very suspiciously at the big trunk, and muttered something to the post boy which Mrs. Wilkinson could not hear. "Will you oblige me by giving my card to his lordship, Mrs. Wilkinson? I want to see him on very particular business. I wrote to his lordship to say that I should be here."
"Wrote to his lordship, did you? Then it's my opinion he won't see you at all."
"Yes, he will. If you'll take him my card, I know he'll see me. Will you oblige me, sir, by taking it into his lordship?" And she put on her most imperious look. The man went, and Mrs. Wilkinson sat silent in the post chaise for a quarter of an hour.
Then the servant returned, informing her that she was to send in her message. His lordship had given directions at the lodge that she was not to come up, and could not understand how it had come to pass that the lady had forced her way to the hall door. At any rate, he would not see her till he knew what it was about. Now it was impossible for Mrs. Wilkinson to explain the exact nature of her very intricate case to Lord Stapledean's butler, and yet she could not bring herself to give up the battle without making some further effort. "It is about the vicarage at Hurst Staple," said she. "The vicarage at Hurst Staple," she repeated, impressing the words on the man's memory. "Don't forget now." The man gave a look of ineffable scorn, then walked away, leaving Mrs. Wilkinson still in the post chaise. And now came on an April shower, such as April showers are on the borders of Westmoreland. It rained and blew, and after a while the rain turned to sleet. The post boy buttoned up his coat, and got under the shelter of the portico. The horses drooped their heads and shivered. Mrs. Wilkinson wished herself back at Hurst Staple, or even comfortably settled at Littlebath, as her son had once suggested. "His lordship don't know nothing about the vicarage," bellowed out the butler, opening the hall door only half way, so that his face just appeared above the lock. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Wilkinson. "Just let me down into the hall, and then I will explain it to you." "Them horses'll be foundered as sure as eggs," said the post boy. Mrs. Wilkinson at last succeeded in making her way into the hall, and the horses were allowed to go round to the yard. And then at last, after half a dozen more messages to and fro, she was informed that Lord Stapledean would see her. So dreadful had been the contest hitherto, that this amount of success was very grateful. Her feeling latterly had been one of intense hostility to the butler, rather than to her son. Now that she had conquered that most savage Cerberus, all would be pleasant with her. But, alas! she soon found that in passing Cerberus she had made good her footing in a region as little desirable as might be. She was ushered into the same book room in which Arthur had been received, and soon found herself seated in the same chair, and on the same spot. Lord Stapledean was thinner now even than he had been then. He had a stoop in his shoulders, and his face and hair were more grey. His eyes seemed to his visitor to be as sharp and almost as red as those of ferrets. As she entered, he just rose from his seat, and pointed to the chair on which she was to sit. "Well, ma'am," said he, "what's all this about the clergyman's house at Hurst Staple? I don't understand it at all."
"No, my lord, I'm sure your lordship can't understand. That's why I have thought it my duty to come all this way to explain it."
"All what way?"
"All the way from Hurst Staple, in Hampshire, my lord. When your lordship was so considerate as to settle what my position in the parish was to be."
"Settle your position in the parish?"
"Yes, my lord, as to my having the income and the house."
"What does the woman mean?" said he, looking down towards the rug beneath his feet, but speaking quite out loud. "Settle her position in the parish! Why, ma'am, I don't know who you are, and what your position is, or anything about you."
"I am the widow of the late vicar, Lord Stapledean, and when he died—"
"I was fool enough to give the living to his son. I remember all about it. He was an imprudent man, and lived beyond his means, and there was nothing left for any of you. Wasn't that it?"
"Yes, my lord," said Mrs. Wilkinson, who was so troubled in spirit that she hardly knew what to say. "That is, we never lived beyond our means at all, my lord. There were 7 children, and they were all educated most respectably. The only boy was sent to college, and I don't think there was any imprudence, indeed I don't, my lord. And there was something saved, and the insurance was always regularly paid, and—"
The Marquis absolutely glared at her as she went on with her domestic defence. The household at Hurst Staple had been creditably managed, considering the income, and it was natural that she should wish to set her patron right. But every word that she said carried her further away from her present object. "And what on earth have you come to me for?" said Lord Stapledean.
"I'll tell your lordship if you'll only allow me 5 minutes. Your lordship remembers when poor Mr. Wilkinson died?"
"I don't remember anything about it."
"Your lordship was good enough to send for Arthur."
"Arthur?"
"Yes, my lord."
"Who's Arthur?"
"My boy, my lord. Don't you remember? He was just in orders then, and so you were good enough to put him into the living. That is to say, not exactly into the living, but to make him curate, as it were, and you allocated the income to me, and—"
"Allocated the income!" said Lord Stapledean, putting up his hands in token of unlimited surprise.
"Yes, my lord. Your lordship saw just how it was, and as I could not exactly hold the living myself—"
"Hold the living yourself! Why, are you not a woman, ma'am?"
"Yes, my lord, of course. That was the reason. So you put Arthur into the living, and you allocated the income to me. That is all settled. Now the question is about the house."
"The woman's mad," said Lord Stapledean, looking again to the carpet, but speaking quite out loud. "Stark mad. I think you'd better go home, ma'am, a great deal better."
"My lord, if you'd only give yourself the trouble to understand me—"
"I don't understand a word you say. I have nothing to do with the income, or the house, or with you, or with your son."
"Oh yes, my lord, indeed you have."
"I tell you I haven't, ma'am, and what's more, I won't."
"He's going to marry, my lord," continued Mrs. Wilkinson, beginning to whimper, "and we are to be turned out of the house, unless you will interfere to prevent it. And he wants me to go and live at Littlebath. And I'm sure your lordship meant me to have the house when you allocated the income."
"And you've come all the way to Bowes, have you, because your son wants to enjoy his own income?"
"No, my lord, he doesn't interfere about that. He knows he can't touch that, because your lordship allocated it to me. And, to do him justice, I don't think he would if he could. And he's not a bad boy, my lord, only mistaken about this."
"Oh, he wants his own house, does he?"
"But it isn't his own house, you know. It has been my house ever since his father died. And if your lordship will remember—"
"I tell you what, Mrs. Wilkinson, it seems to me that your son should not let you come out so far by yourself."
"My lord!"
"And if you'll take my advice, you'll go home as fast as you can, and live wherever he bids you."
"But, my lord—"
"At any rate, I must beg you not to trouble me any more about the matter. When I was a young man, your husband read with me for a few months, and I really think that 2 presentations to the living have been a sufficient payment for that. I know nothing about your son, and I don't want to know anything. I dare say he's as good as most other clergymen."
"Oh yes, he is, my lord."
"But I don't care a straw who lives in the house."
"Don't you, my lord?" said Mrs. Wilkinson, very despondently.
"Not 1 straw. I never heard such a proposition from a woman in my life, never. And now, if you'll allow me, I'll wish you good morning, ma'am. Good morning to you."
And the Marquis made a slight feint, as though to raise himself from his chair. Mrs. Wilkinson got up and stood upright before him, with her handkerchief to her eyes. It was very grievous to her to have failed so utterly. She still felt sure that if Lord Stapledean would only be made to understand the facts of the case, he would even yet take her part. She had come so far to fight her battle,
that she could not bring herself to leave the ground as long as a chance of victory remained to her. How could she put the matter in the fewest words, so as to make the Marquis understand the very, very truth?
If your lordship would only allow me to recall to your memory the circumstances of the case, how you yourself allocated.
Lord Stapledean turned suddenly at the bell rope, and gave it a tremendous pull. Then another, then a third, harder than the others. Down came the rope about his ears, and the peal was heard ringing through the house. "Thompson," he said to the man, as he entered, "show that lady the door." "Yes, my lord." "Show her the door immediately." "Yes, my lord," said Thompson, standing irresolute. "Now, ma'am, the post chaise is waiting." Mrs. Wilkinson had still strength enough to prevent collapse, and to gather herself together with some little feminine dignity.
"I think I have been very badly treated," she said, as she prepared to move.
"Thompson!" shrieked the Marquis in his passion. "Show that lady the door." "Yes, my lord," and Thompson gracefully waved his hand, pointing down the passage. It was the only way in which he could show Mrs. Wilkinson the way out. And then, obedient to necessity, she walked forth. Never had she held her head so high, or tossed her bonnet with so proud a shake, as she did in getting into that post chaise. Thompson held the handle of the carriage door. He also offered her his arm, but she despised any such aid. She climbed in unassisted. The post boy mounted his jade, and so she was driven forth, not without titters from the woman at the lodge gate. With heavy heart she reached the inn, and sat herself down to weep alone in her bedroom. "So you've come back," said the landlady. "Ugh!" exclaimed Mrs. Wilkinson. We will not dwell long on her painful journey back to Hurst Staple, nor on the wretched reflections with which her mind was laden. She sent on a line by post to her eldest daughter, so that she was expected, and Dumpling and the phaeton and the stable boy were there to meet her. She had feared that Arthur would come, but Arthur had dreaded the meeting also, and having talked the matter over with his sisters, had remained at home. He was in the book room, and hearing the wheels as the carriage drew up to the door, he went out to greet his mother on the steps. At the first moment of meeting there was nothing said, but she warmly pressed the hand which he held out to her.
"What sort of a journey have you had?" said Sophia. "Oh, it is a dreadful place," said Mrs. Wilkinson.
"It is not a nice country," said Arthur. By this time they were in the drawing room, and the mother was seated on a sofa, with one of her girls on each side of her.
"Sophy," she said, "get up for a moment. I want Arthur to come here."
So Sophy did get up, and her son, immediately taking her place, put his arm round his mother's waist.
"Arthur," she whispered to him, "I fear I have been foolish about this."
That was all that was ever said to him about the journey to Bowes. He was not the man to triumph over his mother's failure. He merely kissed her when her little confession was made, and pressed her slightly with his arm. From that time it was understood that Adela was to be brought thither as soon as might be, to reign the mistress of the vicarage, and that then what further arrangements might be necessary were to be made by them all at their perfect leisure. That question of the nursery might at any rate remain in abeyance for 12 months. Soon after that it was decided in full conclave that if Adela would consent, the marriage should take place in the summer. Very frequent letters passed between Hurst Staple and Littlebath, and Mrs. Wilkinson no longer alluded to them with severity, or even with dislike. Lord Stapledean had at any rate thoroughly convinced her that the vicarage house belonged to the vicar male, and not to the vicar female; and now that her eyes had been opened on this point, she found herself obliged to confess that Adela Gauntlet would not make a bad wife. "Of course we shall be poor, mother; but we expect that."
"I hope you will at least be happy," said Mrs. Wilkinson,
not liking at present to dwell on the subject of their poverty, as her conscience began to admonish her with reference to the £350 per annum. "I should think I might be able to get pupils," continued Arthur. "If I had two at £150 each, we might be comfortable enough."
"Perhaps Adela would not like to have lads in the house."
"Ah, mother, you don't know Adela. She will not object to anything because she does not herself like it." And in this manner that affair was so far settled. And then Adela was invited to Hurst Staple, and she accepted the invitation. She was not coy in declaring the pleasure with which she did so, nor was she bashful or shamefaced in the matter. She loved the man that she was to marry, had long loved him, and now it was permitted to her to declare her love. Now it was her duty to declare it, and to assure him with all the pretty protestations in her power that her best efforts should be given to sweeten his cup and smooth his path. Her duty now was to seek his happiness, to share his troubles, to be one with him. In her mind it was not less her duty now than it would be when, by God's ordinance, they should be one bone and one flesh. While their mother had held her seat on her high horse with reference to that question of the house, Sophia and Mary had almost professed hostility to Adela. They had given in no cordial adherence to their brother's marriage, but now they were able to talk of their coming sister with interest and affection.
"I know that Adela would like this, Arthur,"
and
"I'm sure that Adela would prefer that,"
and
"When we've gone, you know, Adela will do so and so."
Arthur received all this with brotherly love and the kindest smiles, and thanked God in his heart that his mother had taken that blessed journey to Bowes Lodge. "Adela," he once said to her, as they were walking together one lonely spring evening along the reedy bank of that river, "Adela, had I had your courage, all this would have been settled long since."
"I don't know," she said, "but I am sure of this, that it is much better as it is. Now we may fairly trust that we do know our own minds. Love should be tried, perhaps, before it is trusted."
"I should have trusted yours at the first word you could have spoken, the first look you would have given me."
"And I should have done so too, and then we might have been wrong. Is it not well as it is, Arthur?"
And then he declared that it was very well indeed. Ah, yes, how could it have been better with him? He thought too of his past sorrows, his deep woes, his great disappointments; of that bitter day at Oxford when the lists came down; of the half broken heart with which he had returned from Bowes; of the wretchedness of that visit to West Putford. He thought of the sad hours he had passed, seated idle and melancholy in the vicarage book room, meditating on his forlorn condition. He had so often wailed over his own lot, droning out a dirge, a melancholy via victis. And now for the first time he could change the note. Now his song was Io Triumphe as he walked along. He shouted out a joyful paean with the voice of his heart. Had he taken the most double of all firsts, what more could fate have given to him? Or at any rate, what better could fate have done for him? And to speak sooth, fate had certainly given to him quite as much as he had deserved. And then it was settled that they should be married early in the ensuing June. "On the 1st," said Arthur.
"No, the 30th," said Adela, laughing.
And then, as women always give more than they claim, it was settled that they should be married on the 11th. Let us trust that the day may always be regarded as propitious. Section 44 of The Bertrams by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 14. Mr. Bertram's Death. Sir Henry Harcourt had certainly played his hand badly, considering the number of trumps that he had held, and that he had turned up an honour in becoming Solicitor General. He was not now in a happy condition. He was living alone in his fine house in Eaton Square. He was out of office. He was looked on with an evil eye by his former friends, in that he had endeavoured to stick to office too long. He was deeply in debt, and his once golden hopes with reference to Mr. Bertram were becoming fainter and fainter every day. Nor was this all. Not only did he himself fear that he should get but little of the Hadley money, but his creditors had begun to have the same fears. They had heard that he was not to be the heir, and were importunate accordingly. It might be easy to stave them off till Mr. Bertram should be under the ground, but then, what then? His professional income might still be large, though not increasing as it should have done. And what lawyer can work well if his mind be encumbered by deep troubles of his own? He had told George Bertram that he would go down to Hadley and claim his wife if he did not receive a favourable message from his wife's grandfather, and he now determined to take some such step. He felt himself driven to do something to bring about some arrangement, to make some use of the few remaining grains of sand which were still to run through the glass that was measuring out the lees of life for that old man. So thinking, but not quite resolved as to what he would do when he reached the house, he started for Hadley. He knew that George was still there, that his wife was there, and that Mr. Bertram was there, and he trusted that he should not fail at any rate in seeing them. He was not by nature a timid man, and had certainly not become so by education. But nevertheless his heart did not beat quite equably within his bosom when he knocked at the rich man's door. Of course he was well known to the servant. At first he asked after Mr. Bertram, and was told that he was much the same, going very fast. The maid did not think that Sir Henry could see him. The poor girl, knowing that the gentleman before her was not a welcome visitor, stood in the doorway as though to guard the ladies who were in the drawing room. "Who is here now?" said Sir Henry. "Who is staying here?" "Mr. George," said the girl, thinking that she would be safest in mentioning his name, "and Miss Baker, sir." "Lady Harcourt is here, I suppose?" "Yes, sir. Her ladyship is in the drawing room." And she shook in her shoes before him as she made the announcement. For a moment Sir Henry was inclined to force his way by the trembling young woman, and appear before the ladies. But then what would he get by it? Angry as he was with all the Hadley people, he was still able to ask himself that question. Supposing that he were there, standing before his wife? Supposing even that he were able to bring her to his feet by a glance, how much richer would that make him? What bills would that pay? He had loved his wife once with a sort of love, but that day was gone. When she had been at such pains to express her contempt for him, all tenderness had deserted him. It might be wise to make use of her, not to molest her, as long as her grandfather lived. When the old miser should have gone, it would be time for him to have his revenge. In the meantime he could gain nothing by provoking her. so he told the servant that he wished to see Mr. George Bertram. As it happened, George and Lady Harcourt were together, and Miss Baker was keeping watch with the sick man upstairs. The drawing-room was close to the hall, and Caroline's eager ear caught the tones of her husband's voice. "It is Sir Henry," she said, becoming suddenly pale, and rising to her feet, as though prepared to retreat to some protection. Bertram's duller ear could not hear him, but he also rose from his chair. "Are you sure it is he?" "I hear his voice plainly," said Caroline, in a tremulous whisper. "Do not leave me, George. Whatever happens, do not leave me." They called each other now by their Christian names, as cousins should do, and their intercourse with each other had never been other than cousinly since that parting in Eaton Square. And then the door was opened, and the maid servant, in the glummest of voices, announced that Sir Henry wanted to see Mr. George. "Show him into the dining room," said George; and then, following the girl after a minute's interval, he found himself once more in the presence of his old friend. Sir Henry was even darker looking, and his brow still more forbidding, than at that last interview at George's chambers. He was worn and care-marked, and appeared to be 10 years older than was really the case. He did not wait till George should address him, but began at once. "Bertram," said he, with a voice intended to be stern, "there are 2 persons here I want to see, your uncle and my wife." "I make no objection to your seeing either, if they are willing to see you." "Yes, but that won't do for me. My duty compels me to look after them both, and I mean to do so before I leave Hadley." "I will send your name to them at once," said George; "but it must depend on them whether they will see you." And so saying, he rang the bell, and sent a message up to his uncle. Nothing was said till the girl returned. Sir Henry paced the room backward and forward, and George stood leaning with his back against the chimney-piece. "Mr. Bertram says that he'll see Sir Henry if he'll step upstairs," said the girl. "Very well. Am I to go up now?" "If you please, sir." Bertram followed Sir Henry to the door, to show him the room; but the latter turned round on the stairs, and said that he would prefer to have no one present at the interview. "I will only open the door for you," said the other. This he did, and was preparing to return, when his uncle called him. "Do not go away, George," said he. "Sir Henry will want you to show him down again." And so they stood together at the bedside. "Well, Sir Henry, this is kind of you," said he, putting his thin bony hand out upon the coverlid, by way of making an attempt at an Englishman's usual greeting. Sir Henry took it gently in his, and found it cold and clammy. "It is nearly all over now, Sir Henry," said the old man. "I hope not," said the visitor, with the tone usual on such occasions. "You may rally yet, Mr. Bertram." "Rally!" And there was something in the old man's voice that faintly recalled the bitter railing sound of other days. "No, I don't suppose I shall ever rally much more." "Well, we can only hope for the best. That's what I do, I can assure you." "That is true. We do hope for the best, all of us. I can still do that if I do nothing else." "Of course," said Sir Henry. And then he stood still for a while, meditating how best he might make use of his present opportunity. What could he say to secure some fraction of the hundreds of thousands which belonged to the dying man? That he had a right to at least a moiety of them his inmost bosom told him; but how should he now plead his rights? Perhaps after all it would have been as well for him to have remained in London. "Mr. Bertram," at last he said, "I hope you won't think it unbecoming in me if I say one word about business in your present state." "No, no, no," said the old man. I can't do much, as you see, but I'll endeavour to listen."
"You can't be surprised that I should be anxious about my wife."
"Umph," said Mr. Bertram. "You haven't treated her very well, it seems."
"Who says so?"
"A woman wouldn't leave a fine house in London to shut herself up with a sick old man here, if she were well treated. I don't want any one to tell me that."
"I can hardly explain all this to you now, sir, particularly—"
"Particularly as I am dying? No, you cannot. George, give me a glass of that stuff. I am very weak, Sir Henry, and can't say much more to you."
"May I ask you this one question, sir? Have you provided for your granddaughter?"
"Provided for her!"
And the old man made a sadly futile attempt to utter the words with that ominous shriek which a few years since would have been sure to frighten any man who would have asked such a question.
"What sort of man can he be, George, to come to me now with such a question?"
And so saying, he pulled the clothes over him, as though resolved to hold no further conversation. "He is very weak," said George. "I think you had better leave him." A hellish expression came across the lawyer's face. "Yes," he said to himself, "go away, that I may leave you here to reap the harvest by yourself. Go away, and know myself to be a beggar." He had married this man's grandchild, and yet he was to be driven from his bedside like a stranger.
"Tell him to go," said Mr. Bertram. "He will know it all in a day or two."
"You hear what he says," whispered George. "I do hear," muttered the other, "and I will remember."
"He hardly thinks I would alter my will now, does he? Perhaps he has pen and ink in his pocket, ready to do it."
"I have only spoken in anxiety about my wife," said Sir Henry. "And I thought you would remember that she was your child's daughter."
"I do remember it. George, why doesn't he leave me?"
"Harcourt, it will be better that you should go," said Bertram. "You can have no idea how weak my uncle is." And he gently opened the door. "Good bye, Mr. Bertram. I had not intended to disturb you." And so saying, Sir Henry slunk away. "You know what his will is, of course?" said Sir Henry, when they were again in the dining room. "I have not the slightest idea on the subject," said the other. "Not the remotest conception. He never speaks to me about it." "Well, and now for Lady Harcourt. Where shall I find her?" To this question George gave no answer, nor was he able to give any. Caroline was no longer in the drawing room. Sir Henry insisted that he would see her, and declared his intention of staying in the house till he did so. But Miss Baker at last persuaded him that all his efforts would be useless. Nothing but force would induce Lady Harcourt to meet him. "Then force shall be used," said Sir Henry. "At any rate, not now," said George. "What, sir! Do you set yourself up as her protector? Is she base enough to allow you to interfere between her and her husband?" "I am her protector at the present moment, Sir Henry. What passed between us long since has been now forgotten. But we are still cousins, and while she wants protection, I shall give it to her." "Oh, you will you?" "Certainly. I look upon her as though she were my sister. She has no other brother." "That's very kind of you, and very complaisant of her. But what if I say that I don't choose that she should have any such brother? Perhaps you think that as I am only her husband, I ought not to have any voice in the matter." "I do not suppose that you can care for her much after the word you once used to her." "And what the devil is it to you what word I used to her? That's the tack you go on, is it? Now I'll tell you fairly what I shall do. I will wait till the breath is out of that old man's body, and then I shall take my wife out of this house, by force, if force be necessary." And so saying, Sir Henry turned to the front door,
and took his departure without making any further ado.
"What dreadful trouble we shall have!" whimpered Miss Baker, almost in tears.
Things went on at Hadley for 3 days longer without any change, except that Mr. Bertram became weaker and less inclined to speak. On the third morning he did say a few words. "George, I begin to think I have done wrong about you, but I fear it is too late." His nephew declared that he was sure that things would turn out well, muttering any platitude which might quiet the dying man. "But it is too late, isn't it?"
"For any change in your will, sir? Yes, it is too late. Do not think of it."
"Ah, yes, it would be very troublesome, very troublesome. Oh, me! It has nearly come now, George, very nearly."
It had very nearly come. He did not again speak intelligibly to any of them. In his last hours he suffered considerably, and his own thoughts seemed to irritate him. But when he did mutter a few words, they seemed to refer to trivial matters, little plagues which dying men feel as keenly as those who are full of life. To the last he preferred George either to his niece or to his granddaughter, and was always best pleased when his nephew was by him. Once or twice he mentioned Mr. Pritchett's name, but he showed his dissent when they proposed to send for his man of business. On the afternoon of that day he breathed his last in the presence of his 3 relatives. His nearest relative, indeed, was not there, nor did they dare to send for him. He had latterly expressed so strong a disgust at the very name of Sir Lionel, that they had ceased by common consent to mention Bertram's father. He seemed to be aware that his last moments were approaching, for he would every now and then raise his withered hand from off the bed, as though to give them warning. And so he died, and the eyes of the rich man were closed. He died full of years, and perhaps in one, and that the most usual acceptation of the word, full of honour. He owed no man a shilling, had been true to all his engagements, had been kind to his relatives with a rough kindness. He had loved honesty and industry, and had hated falsehood and fraud. To him the herd, born only to consume the fruits, had ever been odious. That he could be generous, his conduct in his nephew's earliest years had plainly shown. He had carried, too, in his bosom a heart not altogether hardened against his kind, for he had loved his nephew, and to a certain extent his niece also, and his granddaughter. But in spite of all this, he had been a bad man. He had opened his heart to that which should never find admittance to the heart of man. The iron of his wealth had entered into his very soul. He had made 500,000 of money, and that 500,000 had been his God, his only God. And indeed men have but one God. The true worship of the one loved shrine prevents all other worship. The records of his money had been his deity. There in his solitude at Hadley he had sat and counted them as they grew. Mortgages and bonds, deeds and scrip, shares in this and shares in that, thousands in these funds, and tens of thousands in those. To the last he had gone on buying and selling, buying in the cheap market and selling in the dear, and everything had gone well with him. Everything had gone well with him. Such was the city report of old Mr. Bertram. But let the reader say how much, or rather how little, had gone well. Faustus like, he had sold himself to a golden Mephistopheles, and his Margaret had turned to stone within his embrace. How many of us make Faust's bargain! The bodily attendance of the devil may be mythical, but in the spirit he is always with us. And how rarely have we the power to break the contract! The London merchant had so sold himself. He had given himself body and soul to a devil. The devil had promised him wealth,
and had kept his word. And now the end had come, though the day of his happiness had not yet arrived. But the end had not come. All this was but the beginning. If we may believe that a future life is to be fitted to the desires and appetites as they are engendered here, what shall we think of the future of a man whose desire has been simply for riches, whose appetite has been for heaps of money? How miserably is such a poor wretch cheated! How he gropes about, making his bargain with blind eyes, thinking that he sees beyond his neighbours! Who is so green, so soft, so foolishly the victim of the sorriest sharper as this man? Weigh out all his past, and what has it been? Weigh out his future, if you can, and think what it must be. Poor dull Faustus! What! Thou hast lost everything among the thimble riggers? Poor dull stupid wretch! Mr. Bertram had not been a good man, nor had he been a wise man. But he had been highly respectable, and his memory is embalmed in tons of marble and heaps of monumental urns. Epitaphs, believed to be true, testify to his worth. And deeds, which are sometimes as false as epitaphs, do the same. He is a man of whom the world has agreed to say good things, to whom fame, that rich city fame, which speaks with a cornet a piston made of gold instead of a brazen trumpet, has been very kind. But nevertheless he was not a good man. As regards him, it will only remain for us to declare what was his will, and that shall be done in the next chapter. It was settled that he should be buried on the 6th day after his death, and that his will should be read after his funeral. George had now to manage everything, and to decide who should be summoned to the reading. There were two whom he felt bound to call thither, though to them the reading he knew would be a bitter grief. There was in the first place his father, Sir Lionel, whose calls for money had not of late decreased in urgency. It would be seemly that he should come, but the opening of the will would not be a pleasant hour for him. Then there would be Sir Henry. He also was of course summoned, painful as it was to his wife to have to leave the house at such a time. Nor indeed did he wait to be invited, for he had written to say that he should be there before he received George Bertram's note. Mr. Pritchett also was sent for, and the old man's attorney. And then, when these arrangements had been made, the thoughts of the living reverted from the dead to themselves. How should those three persons who now occupied that house so lovingly provide for themselves? And where should they fix their residence? George's brotherly love for his cousin was very well in theory. It was well to say that the past had been forgotten, but there are things for which no memory can lose its hold. He and Caroline had loved each other with other love than that of a brother and a sister, and each knew that they two might not dwell under the same roof. It was necessary to talk over these matters, and in doing so it was very hard not to touch on forbidden subjects. Caroline had made up her mind to live again with her aunt, had made up her mind to do so, provided that her husband's power was not sufficient to prevent it. Miss Baker would often tell her that the law would compel her to return to her lord, that she would be forced to be again the mistress of the house in Eaton Square, and again live as the prosperous wife of the prosperous politician. To this Caroline had answered but little, but that little had been in a manner that had thoroughly frightened Miss Baker. Nothing, Lady Harcourt had said, nothing should induce her to do so.
"But if you cannot help yourself, Caroline?" "I will help myself. I will find a way to prevent, at any rate, that." So much she had said, but nothing further. And so much Miss Baker had repeated to George Bertram, fearing the worst. It was not till the day before the funeral that Caroline spoke to her cousin on the subject. "George," she said to him, "shall we be able to live here, to keep on this house?"
"You and Miss Baker, you mean?"
"Yes, aunt and I. We should be as quiet here as anywhere, and I am used to these people now."
"It must depend on the will. The house was his own property, but doubtless Miss Baker could rent it."
"We should have money enough for that, I suppose."
"I should hope so. But we none of us know anything yet. All your own money, the income at least coming from it, is in Sir Henry's hands."
"I will never condescend to ask for that," she said.
And then there was a pause in their conversation.
"George," she continued, after a minute or two, "you will not let me fall into his hands?"
He could not help remembering that his own mad anger had already thrown her into the hands which she now dreaded so terribly. Oh, if those 2 last years might but pass away as a dream, and leave him free to clasp her to his bosom as his own! But the errors of past years will not turn themselves to dreams. There is no more solid stuff in this material world than they are. They never melt away or vanish into thin air. "Not if it can be avoided," he replied.
"Ah, but it can be avoided, can it not? Say that you know it can. Do not make me despair. It cannot be that he has a right to imprison me."
"I hardly know what he has a right to do; but he is a stern man, and will not easily be set aside."
"But you will not desert me?"
"No, I will not desert you. But—"
"But what?"
"For your sake, Caroline, we must regard what people will say. Our names have been mixed together, but not as cousins."
"I know, I know. But, George, you do not suppose I intended you should live here. I was not thinking of that. I know that that may not be."
"For myself, I shall keep my chambers in London. I shall just be able to starve on there, and then I shall make one more attempt at the bar."
"And I know you will succeed. You are made for success at last. I have always felt that."
"A man must live somehow. He must have some pursuit, and that is more within my reach than any other. Otherwise, I am not very anxious for success. What is the use of it all? Of what use will it be to me now?"
"Oh, George!"
"Well, is it not true?"
"Do not tell me that I have made shipwreck of all your fortune."
"No, I do not say that you have done it. It was I that drove the bark upon the rocks, I myself; but the timbers on that account are not the less shattered."
"You should strive to throw off that feeling. You have so much before you in the world."
"I have striven. I have thought that I could love other women. I have told others that I did love them; but my words were false, and they and I knew that they were false. I have endeavoured to think of other things, of money, ambition, politics; but I can care for none of them. If ever a man cut his own throat, I have done so." She could not answer him at once, because she was now sobbing, and the tears were streaming from her eyes.
"And what have I done?" she said at last. "If your happiness is shattered, what must mine be? I sometimes think that I cannot live and bear it. With him," she added, after another pause, "I will not live and bear it. If it comes to that, I will die, George."
And rising from her chair, she walked across the room and took him sharply by the arm.
"George," she said, "you will protect me from that. I say that you will save me from that."
"Protect you," said he, repeating her words, and hardly daring to look into her face. How could he protect her? How save her from the lord she had chosen for herself? It might be easy enough for him to comfort her now with promises, but he could not find it in his heart to hold out promises which he could not fulfil. If, after the reading of the will, Sir Henry Harcourt should insist on taking his wife back with him, How could he protect her? He, of all men in the world!
"You will not give me up to him," she said wildly. "If you do, my blood will lie upon your head. George, George, say that you will save me from that. To whom can I look now but to you?"
"I do not think he will force you away with him."
"But if he does, will you stand by and see me so used?"
"Certainly not. But, Caroline—"
"Well?"
"It will be better that I should not be driven to interfere. The world will forget that I am your cousin, but will remember that I was once to have been your husband."
"The world! I am past caring for the world. It is nothing to me now if all London knows how it is with me. I have loved, and thrown away my love, and tied myself to a brute. I have loved and do love, but my love can only be a sorrow to me. I do not fear the world, but God and my conscience I do fear. Once for one moment, George, I thought that I would fear nothing. Once for one moment I was still willing to be yours. But I remembered what you would think of me if I should so fall, and I repented my baseness. May God preserve me from such sin. But for the world, why should you or I fear the world?"
"It is for you that I fear it. It would grieve me to hear men speak lightly of your name."
"Let them say what they please. The wretched are always trodden on. Let them say what they please. I deserved it all when I stood before the altar with that man; when I forbade my feet to run, or my mouth to speak, though I knew that I hated him, and owned it to my heart. What shall I do, George, to rid me of that sin?"
She had risen and taken hold of his arm when first she asked him to protect her, and she was still standing beside the chair on which he sat. He now rose also, and said a few gentle words, such as he thought might soothe her.
"Yes," she
continued, as though she did not heed him.
"I said to myself almost 20 times during that last night that I hated him in my very soul, that I was bound in honour even yet to leave him, in honour and in truth, and in justice. But my pride forbade it, my pride and my anger against you."
"It is useless to think of it now, dear."
"Ah, yes, quite useless. Would that I had done it then, at the last moment. They asked me whether I would love that man. I whispered inwardly to myself that I loathed him, but my tongue said yes out loud. Can such a lie as that, told in God's holy temple, sworn before his own altar, can such perjury as that ever be forgiven me? But I shall sin worse still if I go back to him," she continued after a while. "I have no right, George, to ask anything from your kindness as a cousin; but for your love's sake, your old love, which you cannot forget, I do ask you to save me from this. But it is this rather that I ask, that you will save me from the need of saving myself."
That evening George sat up late alone, preparing for the morrow's work, and trying to realize the position in which he found himself. Mr. Pritchett, had he been there, would have whispered into his ears again and again those ominous and all important words,
"500,000 of money, Mr. George, 500,000 of money."
And indeed, though Mr. Pritchett was not there, the remembrance of those overflowing coffers did force themselves upon his mind. Who can say that he, if placed as Bertram then was, would not think of them? He did think of them, not over deeply, nor with much sadness. He knew that they were not to be his, neither the whole of them, nor any part of them. So much his uncle had told him with sufficient plainness. He knew also that they might all have been his. And then he thought of that interview in which Mr. Bertram had endeavoured to beg from him a promise to do that for which his own heart so strongly yearned. Yes, he might have had the bride, and the money too. He might have been sitting at that moment with the wife of his bosom, laying out in gorgeous plans the splendour of their future life. It would be vain to say that there was no disappointment at his heart. But yet there was within his breast a feeling of gratified independence which sufficed to support him. At least he might boast that he had not sold himself, not aloud, but with that inward boasting which is so common with most of us. There was a spirit within him endowed with a greater wealth than any which Mr. Pritchett might be able to enumerate, and an inward love, the loss of which could hardly have been atoned for even by the possession of her whom he had lost. Nor was this the passion which men call self-love. It was rather a vigorous knowledge of his own worth as a man, a strong will which taught him that no price was sufficient to buy his assent that black should be reckoned white, or white be reckoned black. His uncle, he knew, had misunderstood him. In rejecting the old man's offers, he had expressed his contempt for riches, that is, as any counterbalance to independence. Mr. Bertram had taken what he said for more than it was worth, and had supposed that his nephew, afflicted with some singular lunacy, disliked money for its own sake. George had never cared to disabuse his uncle's mind. Let him act as he will, he had said to himself, it is not for me to dictate to him, either on the one side or the other. And so the error had gone on. To morrow morning the will would be read, and George would have to listen to the reading of it. He knew well enough that the world looked on him as his uncle's probable heir, and that he should have to bear Mr. Pritchett's hardly expressed pity, Sir Henry's malignant pleasure, and Sir Lionel's loud disgust. All this was nearly as bad to him as the remembrance of what he had lost. But by degrees he screwed his courage up to the necessary point of endurance. What is Pritchett to me with his kind but burdensome solicitude? What Sir Henry's mad anger? How can they affect my soul? Or what even is my father? Let him rave. I care not to have compassion on myself. Why should his grief assail me? Grief which is so vile, so base, so unworthy of compassion. And thus, schooling himself for the morrow, he betook himself to bed. End of section 44. Section 45 of the Bertrams, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 15. The Will. The only attendants at old Mr. Bertram's funeral were his nephew, Mr. Pritchett, and the Hadley doctor. The other gentlemen were to be present only at the more interesting ceremony of reading the will. Sir Lionel had written to say that he was rather unwell, that he certainly would come up from Littlebath so as to be present at the latter performance, but that the very precarious state of his health, and the very inconvenient hours of the trains, unhappily prevented him from paying the other last sad duty to his brother's remains. Sir Henry Harcourt had plainly demanded at what hour the will would be read, and Mr. Stickatit, junior, Mr. George Stickatit, of the firm of Dry and Stickatit, had promised to be at Hadley punctually at 2 p.m., and he kept his word. Mr. Pritchett came down by an early train, and, as was fit on such an occasion, was more melancholy than usual. He was very melancholy and very sad, for he felt that 500,000 of money was in great jeopardy, and perhaps even the death of his old friend of 40 years' standing may have had some effect on him. It was a mingled feeling that pervaded him.
"Oh, Mr. George," he said, just before they went to the churchyard, "we are grass of the field, just grass of the field, here to day and gone to morrow, flourishing in the morning and cast into the oven before night. It behoves such frail, impotent creatures to look close after their interests. $500,000 of money! I'm afraid you didn't think enough about it, Mr. George." And then the Hadley bells were rung again, but they were not rung loudly. It seemed to Bertram that no one noticed that anything more than usually sad was going on. He could hardly realize it to himself that he was going to put under the ground almost his nearest relative. The bells rang out a dirge, but they did it hardly above their breath. There were but 3 boys gathered at the little gate before the door to see the body of the rich man carried to his last home. George stood with his back to the empty dining-room fireplace. On one side stood Mr. Pritchett, and on the other the Barnet doctor. Very few words passed between them, but they were not in their nature peculiarly lugubrious. And then there was a scuffling heard on the stairs, a subdued, decent undertaker's scuffling, as some hour or two before had been heard the muffled click of a hammer. Feet scuffled down the stairs, outside the dining-room door, and along the passage. And then the door was opened, and in low, decent undertaker's voice, red-nosed, sombre, well-fed Mr. Mortmain told them that they were ready. "These are yours, sir," and he handed a pair of black gloves to George. "And these are yours, sir," and he gave another pair to the doctor. But the doctor held them instead of putting them on. Otherwise Mr. Mortmain could not be expected to change them after the ceremony for a pair of lighter colour. They understood each other, and what could a country doctor do with 20 or 30 pairs of black gloves a year? "And these are yours, Mr. Pritchett." "Oh, George," sighed Pritchett, "to think it should come to this! But he was a good gentleman, and very successful, very successful." There were not 10 people in the church or in the churchyard during the whole time of the funeral. To think that a man with $500,000 of money could die and be got rid of with so little parade! What money could do, in a moderate way, was done. The coffin was as heavy as lead could make it, the cloth of the best. The plate upon it was of silver, or looked like it. There was no room for an equipage of hearses and black coaches, the house was so unfortunately near to the churchyard. It was all done in a decent, sombre, useful, money-making way, as beseemed the remains of such a man. But it was on 'Change that he was truly buried, and Capel Court that his funeral sermon was duly preached. These were the souls that knew him, the ears to which his name loomed large. He had been true and honest in all his dealings, there at least. He had hurt nobody by word or deed, excepting in the way of trade, and had kept his hands from picking and stealing, from all picking, that is, not warranted by city usage, and from all stealing that the law regards as such. Therefore, there on 'Change they preached his funeral sermon loudly, and buried him with all due honours. 2 had been named for the reading of the will, seeing that a train arrived at 1:45 p.m. And therefore, when the ceremony was over, George and Mr. Pritchett had to sit together in the dining-room till that time arrived. The doctor, who did not expect much from the will, had gone away, perhaps to prepare other friends for similar occupation. It was a tedious hour that they so passed, certainly, but at last it did make itself away. Lunch was brought in, and the sherry, which had been handed round with biscuits before the funeral, was again put on the table. Mr. Pritchett liked a glass of sherry, though it never seemed to have other effect on him than to make his sadness of a deeper dye.
But at last, between this occupation and the muttering of a few scraps of a somewhat worldly morality, the hour did wear itself away, and the hand of the old clock pointed to 2. The three gentlemen had come down by the same train, and arrived in a fly together. Mr. George Stickatit, junior, paid for the accommodation, which was no more than right, for he could put it in the bill, and Sir Lionel could not. The mind of Sir Henry was too much intent on other things to enable him to think about the fly. "Well, George," said Sir Lionel, "so it's all over at last. My poor brother! I wish I could have been with you at the funeral, but it was impossible. The ladies are not here?" This he added in a whisper. He could not well talk about Lady Harcourt, and he was not at the present moment anxious to see Miss Baker. "They are not here to day," said George, as he pressed his father's hand. He did not think it necessary to explain that they were staying at good old Mrs. Jones, on the other side of the green. "I should have been down for the funeral," said Mr. Stickatit, "but I have been kept going about the property ever since the death, up to this moment, I may say. There's the document, gentlemen," and the will was laid on the table. "The personalty will be sworn under 5. The real will be about 2 more. Well, Pritchett, and how are you this morning?" Sir Henry said but little to anybody. Bertram put out his hand to him as he entered, and he just took it, muttering something, and then, having done so, he sat himself down at the table. His face was not pleasant to be seen. His manner was ungracious, nay, more than that, uncourteous, almost brutal, and it seemed as though he were prepared to declare himself the enemy of all who were there assembled. To Sir Lionel he was known, and it may be presumed that some words had passed between them in the fly. But there in the room he said no word to any one, but sat leaning back in an arm chair, with his hands in his pockets, scowling at the table before him. "A beautiful day, is it not, Mr. Pritchett?" said Sir Lionel, essaying to make things pleasant after his fashion. "A beautiful day outwardly, Sir Lionel," sighed Mr. Pritchett; "but the occasion is not comfortable. We must all die, though, all of us, Mr. George." "But we shall not all of us leave such a will as that behind us," said Mr. Stickatit. "Come, gentlemen, are we ready? Shall we sit down?" George got a chair for his father, and put it down opposite to that of Sir Henry's. Mr. Pritchett humbly kept himself in one corner. The lawyer took the head of the table, and broke open the envelope which contained the will, with a degree of gusto which showed that the occupation was not disagreeable to him. "Mr. Bertram," said he, "will you not take a chair?" "Thank you, no. I'll stand here, if you please," said George; and so he kept his position with his back to the empty fireplace. All of them then were somewhat afraid of having their disappointment read in their faces, and commented upon by the others. They were all of them schooling themselves to bear with an appearance of indifference the tidings which they dreaded to hear. All of them, that is, except the attorney. He hoped nothing, and feared nothing. Mr. Pritchett nearly closed his eyes, and almost opened his mouth, and sat with his hands resting on his stomach before him, as though he were much too humble to have any hopes of his own. Sir Lionel was all smiles. What did he care? Not he. If that boy of his should get anything, he, as an affectionate father, would of course be glad. If not, why then his dear boy could do without it. That was the intended interpretation of his look, and judging of it altogether, he did not do it badly, only he deceived nobody. On such occasions one's face, which is made up for deceit, never does deceive any one. But in truth Sir Lionel still entertained a higher hope than any other of the listeners there. He did not certainly expect a legacy himself, but he did think that George might still be the heir, as Sir Henry was not to be, whose name was so likely. And then, if his son, his dear son George, should be lord of two, nay, say only one of those many £100,000, what might not a fond father expect? Sir Henry was all frowns, and yet he was not quite hopeless. The granddaughter, the only lineal descendant of the dead man, was still his wife. Anything left to her must in some sort be left to him, let it be tied up with ever so much care. It might still be probable that she might be named the heiress, perhaps the sole heiress. It might still be probable that the old man had made no new will since Caroline had left his home in Eaton Square. At any rate, there would still be a ground on which to fight within his reach, if Lady Harcourt should be in any way enriched under the will. And if so, no tenderness on his part should hinder him from fighting out that fight as long as he had an inch on which to stand. Bertram neither hoped anything nor feared anything, except this, that they would look at him as a disappointed man. He knew that he was to have nothing, and although now that the moment had come he felt that wealth might possibly have elated him, still the absence of it did not make him in any degree unhappy. But it did make him uncomfortable to think that he should be commiserated by Mr. Pritchett, sneered at by Harcourt, and taunted by his father. "Well, gentlemen, are we ready?" said Mr. Stickatit again. They were all ready, and so Mr. Stickatit began. I will not give an acute critic any opportunity for telling me that the will, as detailed by me, was all illegal. I have not by me the ipsissima verba, nor can I get them now, as I am very far from Doctors' Commons. So I will give no verbal details at all. The will, moreover, was very long, no less than 15 folios, and that amount, though it might not be amiss in a 3-volume edition, would be inconvenient when the book comes to be published for 18d. But the gist of the will was as follows. It was dated in the October last gone by, at the time when George was about to start for Egypt, and when Lady Harcourt had already left her husband. It stated that he, George Bertram, senior, of Hadley, being in full use of all his mental faculties, made this as his last will and testament, and then he willed and devised, firstly, that George Stickatit, junior, of the firm of Day and Stickatit, and George Bertram, junior, his nephew, should be his executors, and that £1,000 each should be given to them, provided they were pleased to act in that capacity. When Sir Lionel heard that George was named as one of the executors, he looked up at his son triumphantly. But when the £1,000 were named, his face became rather long, and less pleasant than usual. A man feels no need to leave £1,000 to an executor if he means to give him the bulk of his fortune. Secondly, he left £300 a year for life to his dear old trusty servant, Samuel Pritchett. Mr. Pritchett put his handkerchief up to his face and sobbed audibly, but he would sooner have had £2,000 or £3,000, for he also had an ambition to leave money behind him. Thirdly, he bequeathed £500 a year for life to Mary Baker, late of Littlebath, and now of Hadley, and the use of the house at Hadley if she chose to occupy it. Otherwise the house was to be sold, and the proceeds were to go to his estate. Sir Lionel, when he heard this, made a short calculation in his mind whether it would now be worth his while to marry Miss Baker, and he decided that it would not be worth his while. Fourthly, he gave to his executors above named a sum of £4,000 to be invested by them in the 3 per cent. Consols for the sole use and benefit of his granddaughter, Caroline Harcourt. and the will went on to say that he did this, although he was aware that sufficient provision had already been made for his granddaughter, because he feared that untoward events might make it expedient that she should have some income exclusively her own. Sir Henry, when this paragraph was read, this paragraph from which his own name was carefully excluded, dashed his fist down upon the table so that the ink leaped up out of the inkstand that stood before the lawyer, and fell in sundry blots upon the document. But no one said anything. There was blotting paper at hand, and Mr. Stickatit soon proceeded. In its fifth proviso, the old man mentioned his nephew George. "I wish it to be understood," he said, "that I love my nephew George Bertram, and appreciate his honour, honesty, and truth." Sir Lionel once more took heart of grace, and thought that it might still be all right. And George himself felt pleased, more pleased than he had thought it possible that he should have been at the reading of that will. "But," continued the will, "I am not minded, as he is himself aware, to put my money into his hands for his own purposes." It then went on to say that a further sum of £4,000 was given to him as a token of affection. Sir Lionel drew a long breath. After all, £5,000 was the whole sum total that was rescued out of the fire. What was £5,000? How much could he expect to get from such a sum as that? Perhaps, after all, he had better take Miss Baker. But then her pittance was only for her life. How he did hate his departed brother at that moment! Poor Pritchett wheezed and sighed again. "Ah!" said he to himself, "£500,000 of money gone, clean gone. But he never would take my advice." But George felt now that he did not care who looked at him, who commiserated him. The will was all right. He did not at that moment wish it to be other than that the old man had made it. After all their quarrels, all their hot words, and perverse thoughts towards each other, it was clear to him now that his uncle had at any rate appreciated him. He could hear the remainder of it quite unmoved. There were some other legacies to various people in the city, none of them being considerable in amount. £500 to one, £1,000 to another, £50 to a third, and so on. And then came the body of the will, the very will indeed. And so Mr. George Bertram willed that after the payment of all his just debts and of the legacies above recapitulated, his whole property should be given to his executors, and by them expended in building and endowing a college and almshouse to be called the Bertram College, for the education of the children of London fishmongers, and for the maintenance of the widows of such fishmongers as had died in want. Now, Mr. Bertram had been a member of the Honourable Company of Fishmongers, and that was the end of the will. And Mr. Stickatit, having completed the reading, folded it up and put it back into the envelope. Sir Henry, the moment the reading was over, again dashed his fist upon the table. "As heir at law," said he, "I shall oppose that document." "I think you'll find it all correct," said Mr. Stickatit, with a little smile. "And I think otherwise, sir," said the late Solicitor General, in a voice that made them all start. "Very much otherwise. That document is not worth the paper on which it is written. And now I warn you two who have been named as executors, that such is the fact." Sir Lionel began to consider whether it would be better for him that the will should be a will, or should not be a will. Till he had done so, he could not determine with which party he would side. If that were no will, there might be a previous one, and if so, Bertram might according to that be the heir. "It is a very singular document," said he, "very singular." But Sir Henry wanted no allies. wanted no one in that room to side with him. Hostility to them all was his present desire. To them and to one other, that other one who had brought upon him all this misfortune, that wife of his bosom who had betrayed his interests and shattered his hopes. "I believe there is nothing further to detain us at the present moment," said Mr. Stickatit. "Mr. Bertram, perhaps you can allow me to speak to you somewhere for 5 minutes." "I shall act," said George. "Oh, of course. That's of course," said Stickatit. "And I also." "Stop one moment, gentlemen," shouted Harcourt again. "I hereby give you both warning that you have no power to act." "Perhaps, sir," suggested Stickatit, "your lawyer will take any steps he may think necessary." "My lawyer, sir, will do as I bid him, and will require no suggestion from you. And now I have another matter to treat of. Mr. Bertram, where is Lady Harcourt?" Bertram did not answer at once, but stood with his back still against the chimney piece, thinking what answer he would give. "Where, I say, is Lady Harcourt? Let us have no juggling, if you please. You will find that I am in earnest." "I am not Lady Harcourt's keeper," said George, in a very low tone of voice. "No, by God! Nor shall you be. Where is she? If you do not answer my question, I shall have recourse to the police at once." Sir Lionel, meaning to make things pleasant, now got up and went over to his son. He did not know on what footing, with reference to each other, his son and Lady Harcourt now stood; but he did know that they had loved each other and been betrothed for years. He did know also that she had left her husband, and that her husband and his son had been the closest friends. It was a great opportunity for him to make things pleasant. He had not the slightest scruple as to sacrificing that dear Caroline, whom he had so loved, as his future daughter-in-law. "George," said he, "if you know where Lady Harcourt is, it will be better that you should tell Sir Henry. No properly thinking man will countenance a wife in disobeying her husband." "Father," said George, "Lady Harcourt is not in my custody. She is the judge of her own actions in this matter." "Is she?" said Sir Henry. "She must learn to know that she is not, and that very shortly. Do you mean to tell me where she is?" "I mean to tell you nothing about her, Sir Henry." "George, you are wrong," said Sir Lionel. "If you know where Lady Harcourt is, you are bound to tell him. I really think you are." "I am bound to tell him nothing, father, nor will I. I will have no conversation with him about his wife. It is his affair and hers, and that perhaps of 100 other people; but it certainly is not mine, nor will I make it so." "Then you insist on concealing her?" said Sir Henry. "I have nothing to do with her. I do not know that she is concealed at all." "You know where she is?" "I do. But believing as I do that she would rather not be disturbed, I shall not say where you would find her." "I think you ought, George." "Father, you do not understand this matter." "You will not escape in that way, sir. Here you are named as her trustee in this will." "I am glad that you acknowledge the will at any rate," said Mr. Stickatit. "Who says that I acknowledge it? I acknowledge nothing in the will. But it is clear from that document that she presumes herself to be under his protection. It is manifest that that silly fool intended that she should be so. Now I am not the man to put up with this. I ask you once more, Mr. Bertram, will you tell me where I shall find Lady Harcourt?" "No, I will not." "Very well, then. I shall know how to act. Gentlemen, good morning. Mr. Stickatit, I caution you not to dispose under that will of anything of which Mr. Bertram may have died possessed." And so saying, he took up his hat and left the house. And what would he have done had Bertram told him that Lady Harcourt was staying at Mr. Jones's, in the red brick house on the other side of the green? What can any man do with a recusant wife? We have often been told that we should build a golden bridge for a flying enemy. And if any one can be regarded as a man's enemy, it is a wife who is not his friend. After a little while, Sir Lionel went away with Mr. Pritchett. Bertram asked them both to stay for dinner, but the invitation was not given in a very cordial manner. At any rate, it was not accepted. "Good bye, then, George," said Sir Lionel. "I suppose I shall see you before I leave town. I must say you have made a bad affair of this will." "Good bye, Mr. George, good bye," said Mr. Pritchett. "Make my dutiful compliments to Miss Baker, and to the other lady." "Yes, I will, Mr. Pritchett." "Ah, dear, well. You might have had it all instead of the fishmonger's children, if you had chosen, Mr. George." "And we also will say good bye to the two gentlemen, as we shall not see them again in these pages. That Mr. Pritchett will live for the remainder of his days decently, if not happily, on his annuity, may be surmised. That Sir Lionel, without any annuity, but with a fair income paid from the country's taxes, and with such extra pecuniary aid as he may be able to extract from his son, will continue to live indecently at Littlebath, for he never again returned to active service, that also may be surmised. And thus we will make our bows to these old gentlemen, entertaining, however, very different feelings for them. And soon afterwards Mr. Stickatit also went. Some slight necessary legal information as to the executorship was first imparted. Sir Henry's threats were ridiculed. The good fortune of the fishmongers was wondered at, and then Mr. Stickatit took his hat. The four gentlemen, no doubt, went up to London by the same train. In the evening, Miss Baker and Lady Harcourt came back to their own house. It was Miss Baker's own house now. When she heard what her old friend had done for her, she was bewildered by his generosity. She, at any rate, had received more than she had expected. "And what does he mean to do?" said Caroline. "He says that he will dispute the will; but that, I take it, is nonsense." "But about you know what I mean, George." "He means to insist on your return. That, at least, is what he threatens." "He shall insist in vain. No law that man ever made shall force me to live with him again." Whether or no the husband was in earnest, it might clearly be judged, from the wife's face and tone, that she was so. On the next morning George went up to London, and the two women were left alone in their dull house at Hadley. Section 46 of The Bertrams, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 16. Eaton Square. Sir Henry Harcourt had walked forth first from that room in which the will had been read, and he had walked forth with a threat in his mouth. But he knew when making it that that threat was an empty bravado. The will was as valid as care and law could make it, and the ex-solicitor general knew very well that it was valid. He knew, moreover, that the assistance of no ordinary policeman would suffice to enable him to obtain possession of his wife's person, and he knew also that if he had such possession it would avail him nothing. He could not pay his debts with her, nor could he make his home happy with her, nor could he compel her to be in any way of service to him. It had all been bravado. But when men are driven into corners, when they are hemmed in on all sides, so that they have no escape, to what else than bravado can they have recourse? With Sir Henry the game was up, and no one knew this better than himself. He was walking up and down the platform, with his hat over his brows and his hands in his trousers pockets, when Mr. Stickatit came up. "We shall have a little rain this afternoon," said Mr. Stickatit, anxious to show that he had dropped the shop, and that having done so he was ready for any of the world's ordinary converse. Sir Henry scowled at him from under the penthouse lid of his hat, and passed on in his walk without answering a word. The thing had gone too far with him for affectation. He did not care to make sacrifice now to any of the world's graces. His inner mind was hostile to that attorney of Bucklersbury, and he could dare to show that it was so. After that Mr. Stickatit made no further remark to him. Yes, he could afford now to be forgetful of the world's graces, for the world's heaviest cares were pressing very heavily on him. When a man finds himself compelled to wade through miles of mud, in which he sinks at every step up to his knees, he becomes forgetful of the blacking on his boots. Whether or no his very skin will hold out is then his thought. And so it was now with Sir Henry. Or we may perhaps say that he had advanced a step beyond that. He was pretty well convinced now that his skin would not hold out. He still owned his fine house in Eaton Square, and still kept his seat for the Battersea Hamlets, but Baron Brawl and such like men no longer came willingly to his call, and his voice was no longer musical to the occupants of the Treasury bench. His reign had been sweet, but it had been very short. Prosperity he had known how to enjoy, but adversity had been too much for him. Since the day when he had hesitated to resign his high office, his popularity had gone down like a leaden plummet in the salt water. He had become cross-grained, ill-tempered, and morose. The world had spoken evil of him regarding his wife, and he had given the world the lie in a manner that had been petulant and injudicious. The world had rejoined, and Sir Henry had in every sense got the worst of it. Attorneys did not worship him as they had done, nor did vice-chancellors and lords justices listen to him with such bland attention. No legal luminary in the memory of man had risen so quickly and fallen so suddenly. It had not been given to him to preserve an even mind when adversity came upon him, but the worst of his immediate troubles were his debts. He had boldly resolved to take a high position in London, and he had taken it. It now remained that the piper should be paid, and the piper required payment not in the softest language. While that old man was still living, or rather still dying, he had had an answer to give to all pipers, but that answer would suffice him no longer. Every clause in that will would be in the Daily Jupiter of the day after to-morrow, the Daily Jupiter which had already given a wonderfully correct biography of the deceased great man. As soon as he reached the London station he jumped into a cab, and was quickly whirled to Eaton Square. The house felt dull and cold and wretched to him. It was still the London season, and Parliament was sitting. After walking up and down his own dining room for half an hour, he got into another cab and was whirled down to the House of Commons. But there it seemed as though all the men round him already knew of his disappointment, as though Mr. Bertram's will had been read in a committee of the whole House. Men spoke coldly to him and looked coldly at him, or at any rate he thought that they did so. Some debate was going on about the ballot, at which members were repeating their last year's speeches with new emphasis. Sir Henry twice attempted to get upon his legs, but the speaker would not have his eye caught. Men right and left of him, who were minnows to him in success, found opportunities for delivering themselves, but the world of Parliament did not wish at present to hear anything further from Sir Henry, so he returned to his house in Eaton Square. As soon as he found himself again in his own dining room, he called for brandy, and drank off a brimming glass. He drank off one, and then another. The world and solitude together were too much for him, and he could not bear them without aid. Then, having done this, he threw himself into his arm-chair and stared at the fireplace. How tenfold sorrowful are our sorrows when born in solitude! Some one has said that grief is half removed when it is shared. How little that some one knew about it! Half removed! When it is duly shared between two loving hearts, does not love fly off with 8/10 of it? There is but a small remainder left for the two to bear between them. But there was no loving heart here. All alone he had to endure the crushing weight of his misfortunes. How often has a man said, when evil times have come upon him, that he could have borne it all without complaint but for his wife and children. The truth, however, has been that, but for them, he could not have borne it at all. Why does any man suffer with patience the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or put up with the whips and scorns of time, but that he does so for others, not for himself? It is not that we should all be ready, each to make his own quietus with a bare bodkin, but that we should run from wretchedness when it comes in our path. Who fights for himself alone? Who would not be a coward if none but himself saw the battle, if none others were concerned in it? With Sir Henry there was none other to see the battle, none to take concern in it. If solitude be bad in times of misery, what shall we say of unoccupied solitude, of solitude, too, without employment for the man who has been used to labour? Such was the case with him. His whole mind was out of tune. There was nothing now that he could do, no work to which he could turn himself. He sat there gazing at the empty fireplace till the moments became unendurably long to him. At last his chief suffering arose, not from his shattered hopes and lost fortunes, but from the leaden weight of the existing hour. What could he do to shake this off? How could he conquer the depression that was upon him? He reached his hand to the paper that was lying near him, and tried to read. But his mind would not answer to the call. He could not think of the right honourable gentleman's speech, or of the very able leading article in which it was discussed. Though the words were before his eyes, he still was harping back on the injustice of that will, or the iniquity of his wife, on the imperturbable serenity of George Bertram, or the false fleeting friends who had fawned on him in his prosperity, and now threw him over as a Jonah, with so little remorse. He dropped the paper on the ground, and then again the feeling of solitude and of motionless time oppressed him with a weight as of tons of lead. He jumped from his chair and paced up and down the room, but the room was too confined. He took his hat, and pressing it on his brow, walked out into the open air. It was a beautiful spring evening in May, and the twilight still lingered, though the hour was late. He paced 3 times round the square, regardless of the noise of carriages and the lights which flashed forth from the revelries of his neighbours. He went on and on, not thinking how he would stem the current that was running against him so strongly, hardly trying to think, but thinking that it would be well for him if he could make the endeavour. Alas, he could not make it. And then again he returned to the house, and once more sat himself down in the same arm-chair. Was it come to this, that the world was hopeless for him? One would have said not. He was in debt, it is true, had fallen somewhat from a high position, had lost the dearest treasure which a man can have, not only the treasure, but the power of obtaining such treasure, for the possession of a loving wife was no longer a possibility to him. But still he had much: his acknowledged capacity for law pleadings, his right to take high place among law pleaders, the trick of earning money in that fashion of life, All these were still his. He had his gown and wig and forensic, brow-beating, brazen scowl. Nay, he still had his seat in Parliament. Why should he have despaired? But he did despair, as men do when they have none to whom they can turn trustingly in their miseries. This man had had friends by hundreds, good, serviceable, parliamentary, dinner-eating, dinner-giving friends, fine, pleasant friends, as such friends go. He had such friends by hundreds, but he had failed to prepare for stormy times a leash or so of true hearts on which, in stress of weather, he could throw himself with undoubting confidence. One such friend he may have had once, but he now was among his bitterest enemies. The horizon round him was all black, and he did despair. How many a man lives and dies without giving any sign whether he be an arrant coward or a true-hearted, brave hero? One would have said of this man, a year since, that he was brave enough. He would stand up before a bench of judges, with the bar of England round him, and shout forth with brazen trumpet things that were true or things that were not true, striking down a foe here to the right, and slaughtering another there to the left, in a manner which, for so young a man, filled beholders with admiration. He could talk by the hour among the Commons of England, and no touch of modesty would ever encumber his speech. He could make himself great by making others little, with a glance. But for all that he was a coward. Misfortune had come upon him, and he was conquered at once. Misfortune had come upon him, and he found it unendurable. Yes, utterly unendurable. The grit and substance of the man within were not sufficient to bear the load which fate had put upon them. As does a deal table, in similar case, they were crushed down, collapsed, and fell in. The stuff there was not good mahogany or sufficient hardwood, but an unseasoned, soft, porous deal board, utterly unfit to sustain such pressure. An unblushing, wordy barrister may be very full of brass and words, and yet be no better than an unseasoned, porous deal board, even though he have a seat in Parliament. He rose from his chair and again took a glass of brandy. How impossible it is to describe the workings of a mind in such a state of misery as that he then endured. What? Was there no release for him? No way, spite of this black fit, to some sort of rest, to composure of the most ordinary kind? Was there nothing that he could do which would produce for him, if not gratification, then at least quiescence? To the generality of men of his age there are resources in misfortune. Men go to billiard tables, or to cards, or they seek relief in woman's society, from the smiles of beauty or a laughter-moving tongue. But Sir Henry, very early in life, had thrown those things from him. He had discarded pleasure, and wedded himself to hard work at a very early age. If at the same time he had wedded himself to honesty also, and had not discarded his heart, it might have been well with him. He again sat down, and then he remained all but motionless for some 20 minutes. It had now become dark, but he would have no lights lit. The room was very gloomy with its red embossed paper and dark ruby curtains. As his eye glanced round during the last few moments of the dusk, he remembered how he had inquired of his Caroline how many festive guests might sit at their ease in that room, and eat the dainties which he, with liberal hand, would put before them. Where was his Caroline now? Where were his guests? What anxiety now had he that they should have room enough? What cared he now for their dainties? It was not to be borne. He clasped his hand to his brow, and rising from his chair, he went upstairs to his dressing room. For what purpose he had not even asked himself. Of bed and rest and sleep he had had no thought. When there, he again sat down and mechanically dressed himself as though he were going out to some gay evening party, was even more than ordinarily particular about his toilette. One white handkerchief he threw aside as spoiled in the tying. He looked specially to his boots, and with scrupulous care brushed the specks of dust from the sleeve of his coat. It was a blessing, at any rate, to have something to do. He did this, and then. When he commenced his work, he had perhaps some remote intention of going somewhere. If so, he had quickly changed his mind; for, having finished his dressing, he again sat himself down in an arm-chair. The gas in his dressing-room had been lighted, and here he was able to look around him and see what resources he had to his hand. One resource he did see. Ah me! Yes, he saw it, and his mind approved. Such amount of mind as he had then left to him. But he waited patiently a while, with greater patience than he had hitherto exhibited that day. He waited patiently, sitting in his chair, for some hour or so. Nay, it may have been for 2 hours, for the house was still and the servants were in bed. Then, rising from his chair, he turned the lock of his dressing-room door. It was a futile precaution, if it meant anything, for the room had another door which opened to his wife's chamber, and the access on that side was free and open. Early on the following morning, George Bertram went up to town, and was driven directly from the station to his dull, dingy, dirty chambers in the Temple. His chambers were not as those of practising lawyers. He kept no desk there, and no servant peculiar to himself. It had suited him to have some resting place for his foot that he could call his home. And when he was there, he was waited upon by the old woman who called herself the laundress, probably from the fact of her never washing herself or anything else. When he reached this sweet home on the morning in question, he was told by the old woman that a very express messenger had been there that morning, and that, failing to find him, the express messenger had gone down to Hadley. They had therefore passed each other upon the road. The express messenger had left no message, but the woman had learned that he had come from Eaton Square. And he left no letter? No, sir, no letter. He had no letter. But he was very eager about it. It was something of importance, surely. It might have been natural that, under such circumstances, George should go off to Eaton Square. But it struck him as very probable that Sir Henry might desire to have some communication with him, but that he, when he should know what that communication was, would in no degree reciprocate that desire. The less that he had to say to Sir Henry Harcourt at present, perhaps the better. So he made up his mind that he would not go to Eaton Square. After he had been in his rooms for about half an hour, he was preparing to leave them, and had risen with that object, when he heard a knock at his door, and quickly following the knock, the young attorney who had read the will was in his room. "You have heard the news, Mr. Bertram?" said he. "No, indeed. What news? I have just come up." "Sir Henry Harcourt has destroyed himself. He shot himself in his own house yesterday, late at night, after the servants had gone to bed." George Bertram fell back, speechless, on to the sofa behind him, and stared almost unconsciously at the lawyer. "It is too true, sir. That will of Mr. Bertram's was too much for him. His reason must have failed him, and now he is no more." And so was made clear what were the tidings with which that express messenger had been laden. There was little or nothing more to be said on the matter between George Bertram and Mr. Stickatit. The latter declared that the fact had been communicated to him on authority which admitted of no doubt, and the other, when he did believe, was but little inclined to share his speculations on it with the lawyer. Nor was there much for Bertram to do, not at once. The story had already gone down to Hadley, had already been told there to her to whom it most belonged, and Bertram felt that it was not at present his province to say kind things to her, or seek to soften the violence of the shock. No, not at present. Section 47 of The Bertrams by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 7. Conclusion. Methinks it is almost unnecessary to write this last chapter. The story, as I have had to tell it, is all told. The object has been made plain, or if not, can certainly not be made plainer in these last 6 or 7 pages. The results of weakness and folly, of such weakness and such folly as is too customary among us, has been declared. What further fortune fate had in store for those whose names have been familiar to us might be guessed by all. But, nevertheless, custom and the desire of making an end of the undertaken work, and in some sort completing it, compel me to this concluding chapter. Within 6 weeks after the death of Sir Henry Harcourt, the vicar of Hurst Staple was married to Adela Gauntlet. Every critic who weighs the demerits of these pages, nay, every reader, indulgent or otherwise, who skims through them, will declare that the gentleman was not worthy of the lady. I hope so with all my heart. I do sincerely trust that they will think so. If not, my labour has been in vain. Mr. Arthur Wilkinson was not worthy of the wife with whom a kind Providence had blessed him, was not worthy of her in the usual acceptation of the word. He was not a bad man, as men go, but she was. I must not trust myself to praise her, or I shall be told, not altogether truly, that she was of my own creating. He was not worthy of her, that is, the amount of wealth of character which he brought into that life partnership was, when counted up, much less than her contribution. But that she was fully satisfied with her bargain, that she was so then and so continued, was a part of her worthiness. If ever she weighed herself against him, the scale in which he was placed never in her eyes showed itself to be light. She took him for her lord, and, with a leal heart and a loving bosom, she ever recognized him as her head and master, as the pole star to which she must turn, compelled by laws of adamant. Worthy or unworthy, he was all that she expected, all that she desired, bone of her bone, flesh of her flesh, the father of her bairns, the lord of her bosom, the staff of her maintenance, the prop of her house. And what man was ever worthy, perfectly worthy, of a pure, true, and honest girl? Man's life admits not of such purity and honesty, rarely of such truth. But one would not choose that such flowers should remain unplucked because no hands are fit to touch them. As to the future life of the vicar of Hurst Staple and his wife, it is surely unnecessary to say much, or perhaps anything. It cannot be told that they became suddenly rich. No prime minister, won by her beauty or virtue, placed him upon the bench, or even offered him a deanery. Vicar of Hurst Staple he is still, and he still pays the old allowance out of his well-earned income to his mother, who lives with her daughters at Littlebath. One young lad after another, or generally 2 at a time, share the frugal meals at the parsonage, and our friend is sometimes heard to boast that none of these guests of his have as yet been plucked. Of the good things of the world there is quite enough for her, and we may perhaps say nearly enough for him. Who then shall croak that they are poor? And now and then they walk along the river to West Putford, for among their choicest blessings is that of having a good neighbour in the old rectory. And walking there, how can they but think of old sorrows and present joys? "Ah!" she whispered to him one day, as they crept along the reedy margin in the summer evening, not long after their marriage. "Ah, dearest! It is better now than it was when you came here once." "Is it, love?" "Is it not? But you misbehaved then. You know you did. You would not trust me then." "I could not trust myself." "I should have trusted you in all things, in everything, as I do now." And then he cut at the rushes with his walking stick as he had done before, and bethought himself that in those days he had been an ass. And so we will leave them. May they walk in those quiet paths for long days yet to come, and may he learn to know that God has given him an angel to watch at his side. Of the rosy Miss Todd there is nothing to be said but this, that she is still Miss Todd, and still rosy. Whether she be now at Littlebath, or Baden, or Dieppe, or Harrogate, at New York, Jerusalem, or Fraser's River, matters but little. Where she was last year, there she is not now. Where she is now, there she will not be next year. But she still increases the circle of her dearly loved friends, and go where she will, she at any rate does more good to others than others do to her. And so we will make our last bow before her feet. We have only now to speak of George Bertram and of Lady Harcourt, of them and of Miss Baker, who need hardly now be considered a personage apart from her niece. No sooner was the first shock of Sir Henry Harcourt's death past than Bertram felt that it was impossible for him at the present moment to see the widow. It was but a few days since she had declared her abhorrence of the man to whom her fate was linked apparently for life, and who was now gone. And that declaration had implied also that her heart still belonged to him, George Bertram, him to whom it had first been given, to him rather who had first made himself master of it, almost without gift on her part. Now, as regarded God's laws, her hand was free again, and might follow her heart. But death closes many a long account, and settles many a bitter debt. She could remember now that she had sinned against her husband as well as he against her, that she had sinned the first, and perhaps the deepest. He would have loved her if she would have permitted it, have loved her with a cold, callous, worldly love, but still with such love as he had to give. But she had married him resolving to give no love at all, knowing that she could give none, almost boasting to herself that she had told him that she had none to give. The man's blood was in some sort on her head, and she felt that the burden was very heavy. All this Bertram understood, more thoroughly perhaps than she did, and for many weeks he abstained altogether from going to Hadley. He met Miss Baker repeatedly in London, and learned from her how Lady Harcourt bore herself, how she bore herself outwardly, that is. The inward bearing of such a woman in such a condition it was hardly given to Miss Baker to read. She was well in health, Miss Baker said, but pale and silent, stricken, and for hours motionless. "Very silent," Miss Baker would say. "She will sit for a whole morning without speaking a word, thinking, thinking, thinking." Yes, she had something of which to think. It was no wonder that she should sit silent. And then, after a while, he went down to Hadley and saw her. "Caroline, my cousin," he said to her. "George, George!" And then she turned her face from him and sobbed violently. They were the first tears she had shed since the news had reached her. She did feel in very deed that the man's blood was on her head. But for her, would he not be sitting among the proud ones of the land? Had she permitted him to walk his own course by himself, would this utter destruction have come upon him? Or, having sworn to cherish him as his wife, had she softened her heart towards him, would this deed have been done? No. 50 times a day she would ask herself the question, and as often would she answer it by the same words. The man's blood was upon her head. For many a long day Bertram said nothing to her of her actual state of existence. He spoke neither of her past life as a wife, nor her present life as a widow. The name of that man whom, living, they had both despised and hated, was never mentioned between them during all these months. And yet he was frequently with her. He was with her aunt, rather, and thus she became used to having him sitting in the room beside her. When in her presence he would talk of their money matters, of the old man and his will, in which, luckily, the name of Sir Henry Harcourt was not mentioned. And at last they brought themselves to better subjects, higher hopes, hopes that might yet be high, and solace that was trustworthy, in spite of all that was come and gone. And she would talk to him of himself as divided from her in all things, except in cousinhood. And at her instigation he again put himself to work in the dusky purlieus of Chancery Lane. Mr. Die had now retired, and drank his port and counted his per cents in the blessed quiet of his evening days. But a Gamaliel was not wanting, and George sat himself down once more in the porch. We may be sure that he did not sit altogether in vain. And then Adela, Mrs. Wilkinson we should now call her, visited the two ladies in their silent retirement at Hadley. What words were uttered between her and Lady Harcourt were heard by no other human ear, but they were not uttered without effect. She who had been so stricken could dare again to walk to church, and to bear the eyes of the little world around her. She would again walk forth and feel the sun, and know that the fields were green, and that the flowers were sweet, and that praises were to be sung to God, for his mercy endureth for ever. It was 5 years after that night in Eaton Square when George Bertram again asked her who had once been Caroline Waddington, to be his wife. But, sweet ladies, sweetest, fairest maidens, there were no soft honey words of love then spoken, no happy eager vows which a novelist may repeat, hoping to move the soft sympathy of your bosoms. It was a cold, sad, dreary matter, that offer of his, her melancholy, silent acquiescence, and that marriage in Hadley Church, at which none were present but Adela and Arthur and Miss Baker. It was Adela who arranged it, and the result has shown that she was right. They now live together very quietly, very soberly, but yet happily. They have not Adela's blessings. No baby lies in Caroline's arms. No noisy boy climbs on the arm of George Bertram's chair. Their house is childless, and very, very quiet. But they are not unhappy. Reader, can you call to mind what was the plan of life which Caroline Waddington had formed in the boldness of her young heart? Can you remember the aspirations of George Bertram, as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, watching the stones of the temple over against him? End of Section 47.